Well, let's just get into it. This is welcome to immigration. Welcome to immigration.
This is immigration. That's it. We changed the name of the podcast, Immigration.
Welcome to Redirect, Immigration Law and Perspectives. We're just calling this a bi-weekly. Can we do that? That's all I have the energy for these days, every other week.
Sporadic.
Immigration Law Podcast. I can't even do the intro. We're losing all our listeners right here on this episode. My name is Stephen Robbins. I'm here with fellow immigration attorney Matthew Archambault in the great city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. How are you, Matthew?
So I took a COVID test.
Tight.
It came back negative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Pretty excited about that. But I'm not feeling that great. Yeah.
One thing I love about COVID, one of the cool things about COVID is having the sniffles and immediately assuming that you're carrying around a deadly virus in your body. So that's a fun little side effect. My daughter had to miss like the entire first week of school because she came home after the first day and had a fever. And then it was, a whole thing, had to get tested. And it turns out she's just sick because that's what kids do. They get sick all the time.
Yeah, my little one is missing the second day of school while we await his COVID test. So,
what an ass.
Yeah. Anyway, so we are here to talk about
immigration stuff. Can I ask you something first? I want to ask.
Okay. This is why I'm here, Stephen. I'm here to answer your questions.
What is a work permit? No, just kidding. So
I have no idea.
But seriously, there's a weird dynamic with doing the show. I do feel like, and I know you don't necessarily feel this way, but I have to pull some punches sometimes and not talk about certain experiences or certain things because my clients, their lives are in the hands of these officers or attorneys who work for the government, some of whom I know have listened to this show before. I've heard that there are judges, oil attorneys, like firsthand that I've heard have listened to this show. Now, that doesn't mean they listen.
And if they're not Patreons, then...
Right. Go yourself. But
yeah.
Anyways, I have to be careful about what we say and that sort of thing. That's a whole dynamic. Now, I've just had a string of experiences where it feels like DHS is being over the top aggressive, like gratuitously, in a way that ¿Cómo se dice? I can't talk today.
Belies. Typically, I'm the one that has the problem with the English language.
Belilies. That belies my 10 years of experience doing this kind of work. Just over the top arguments, like weirdly aggressive in cases that feel like they should be straightforward, even like maybe stipulations. And instead we get dragged through these long hearings with weird legal positions and weird arguments from ICE. And I'm starting to feel like I'm going to put on my tinfoil hat. Okay. Like, is it possible that I'm being targeted because I've offended somebody? The word's gotten out and they're just going to take it to me. Because I told a colleague about this recent experience with this one particular trial attorney. And he's like, wow, yeah, that's terrible. And then literally the next day he texts me and says, oh, they just sent me a stipulation to a dismissal in my case that was like not that sympathetic. So it's just weird. What's happening to me? Yes,
I've gotten that vibe as well.
Should we quit this show? I feel like I almost owe it to my clients to just stop this show, or maybe we should start a pro DHS podcast.
Yeah. I was in court the other day, and this DHS attorney, that cross-examination was on point. Boy, he brought up some good facts. And by the time he was done, I stipulated to removal.
Sometimes when you're down, and you got to admit when the other side puts up some good arguments.
So I've had more positive experiences in the last week or so, but I did have one kind of weird email exchange where I never had an email from this trial attorney before. And it was kind of a little of a chain email because one trial attorney was handing me off to another. It was kind of funny because I had asked for prosecutorial discretion, and then one trial attorney on the case had already denied it to me. Then we were in court. He made a point to deny it again in front of the judge. And then the judge had to give an oral decision the next day, and we're going to do it on telephone. And so he was the trial attorney, this new guy sitting in, and then he sent me a separate email saying, I review your case and we have to respectfully recline your request for PD.
Did they recline the request or did they decline the request?
They probably declined it. And so I just said, LOL. I said,
wait, did you?
No worries. I'm used to the reflexive declination of my request for PD. And then he responded as, we are used to your unprofessional emails. It's like, it's the first email I've ever sent to this guy.
Correct.
You know?
Yeah.
And one, I'm thinking like maybe he's, and if he has, like, shout out to you.
Shout out to that guy.
DHS attorney.
That guy's right, though. Did you put LOL, the letters, in your email?
Yeah, I put LOL.
I mean, that is unprofessional. I think he's right.
Oh.
I'm going to have to side with DHS on this one. Not just because I'm trying to get brownie points for my next case.
There are equals.
No,
I don't feel any.
I read in the blue book, you're supposed to type haha, not LOL.
Okay.
Haha. Yeah, or the crying laugh.
Was it LMAO? That's unprofessional.
Oh, right, because it's got the ass in it.
Yeah, I think LOL is fine.
It's acceptable.
You know?
Well, East Coast lawyers, they have their own standards, I guess.
One thing that we were kind of going back and forth, I had asked several times, like, can you kind of guys explain your reasoning?
Right.
Because there's a new PD memo that kind of clears everything up. And what's really frustrating is this request I put in for PD was at the request of one of the DHS attorneys. Like, why don't you put in a request for PD? And I'm like, to be honest, I think it's all bullshit because all you guys do is deny them. So why am I going to waste my time?
Right.
It's like, no, go ahead. So I did it, and he denied it. This trial attorney was actually being nice, and I don't think he was trying to play any games or anything.
I'm super curious to hear from other lawyers in other contexts, like criminal law or whatever, if it would ever happen that a prosecutor would come to you and say, like, hey, why don't you ask me for a deal? And then you ask for a deal and they go, no. What is that? That's not happening in other parts of the law, right?
Yeah, but I mean, it's so like not within their purview to approve. And the thing is, they haven't even looked at the cases. But the thing is, like, when you ask them, why are you denying it? They won't give you an answer.
Right.
And I don't understand why, because, for example, if they said, you know what, your guy's lived here for 5 years, you haven't shown us any evidence that he's been paying taxes.
Right.
Oh, is that important to you? Okay.
Let me get that. I'll send that over.
Yeah, you're right. He hasn't paid taxes, or actually he has.
Right.
And I don't even know. Honestly, I just pulled that out of the air because they've never given me a reason. So one thing that we were waiting for is they kept saying, we're going to issue new guidelines for PD. And they did on September 30th.
Right.
I mean, probably our listeners probably heard a big kind of jubilation. We were like banging pots in the streets. And I called up Steven. He was crying after reading these because it was so like, oh my God, it's about time. And we finally got what we were asking for.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Steven, you've had a chance to review this document, and would you classify this as a game changer?
Should I put on my Chuck Todd goatee? Game changer. Well, I think it's important to give a little bit of a timeline. Obviously, Biden's elected. He takes office in January. He signs a deportation moratorium, which is immediately stopped by the courts, and then they don't bother fighting it in court. So that doesn't happen. Deportations continue. We're waiting and waiting for some sort of guidance. Well, actually, there was an executive order, I think the first day.
Yeah.
It seems like.
Yeah.
I don't even remember. But then in May, end of May, they have a memo sort of saying, like, we're going to focus on terrorists mostly. Mm-hmm. And,
the really bad ones.
Really bad ones. And there's some sort of discretion available. Okay, that's cool. And then it turns out it kind of doesn't change much of anything. Here we are on September 30th.
But they were promising this. So like, we're going to put out more guidance.
There's something else coming down the line.
Yeah.
So here's Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas sort of explaining what's going on. He says, "We are guided by the knowledge that there are individuals in our country who have been here for generations and contributed to our country's well-being. As we strive to provide them with a path to status, we will not work in conflict by spending resources seeking to remove those who do not pose a threat and, in fact, make our nation stronger." Okay, so that's bullshit, because days later, I'm in court with somebody, sympathetic cases I've ever presented, and I am getting literally the toughest cross-examination, the toughest prosecution I've ever faced in immigration court. So I don't know what this is all about, but basically these guidelines supposedly prioritize removal of individuals who pose a threat to national security, like terrorists and spies. Like, okay, duh. That should have, that's kind of always been the case.
Under Obama, remember how we just remember the terrorism visas that we would get for our clients?
I remember the one criticism of Obama that I think was really legit is he was real soft on spies.
Yeah.
Very soft.
Yeah, all my spies had no problem.
And then those who pose a threat to public safety and those who have committed serious crimes. So we're more towards the open borders, let's have open minds about these things side of the argument. But I think that we can agree that, like, if there's a deportation mechanism and scheme in place, in theory, those should be the people that you focus on. Although if somebody's a terrorist or a spy, I mean, just kicking them out of the country doesn't really make the world a better place.
If you're going to draw lines, which again, I'm against, but okay, so they're drawing some lines here. But the thing is, do they even mean anything? When I first started reading this, the one thing where I stopped reading, I did one of those, hell, because I know it's going to be all bullshit, is on the second page, he writes, "In an opinion by Justice Scalia." Just then, I just thought, I'm like, you know what? Come on. Stop it. You're pandering so hard to the right.
To people who will not read this.
Yeah, it's open borders to them, right?
Yeah.
Having a name check Justice Scalia, I mean, I can't believe Ronald Reagan didn't get a mention in here, Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
It's a very silly thing to do from Mayorkas. But the thing is, the memo doesn't say anything new. And also, it's not even effective until November 29th, when they're supposed to, in that time, give out even more guidance.
Yeah.
So this is a guidance that we were waiting for that promises us more guidance.
One thing that's maybe kind of new, and in theory, this is a good thing. In practice, I have no idea how this would even be implemented, if at all, but it says that rather than relying on the fact that somebody was convicted, the officials should, quote, dig into the circumstances of criminal convictions. So looking at, why something happened, a sort of classic thing that we see a lot is a victim of domestic violence who, after years of abuse, ends up convicted of domestic violence or arrested for domestic violence because they've defended themselves, or their abuser has made up something and weaponized the police against them. So it's good that they should not just look at, well, you were convicted of assault, domestic violence, but look at the circumstances. That's a nice little thing to have included. But I mean, who's reviewing?
But it won't happen.
It won't. Right.
I mean, can we be honest, right? You have a person that has a DUI, they're not going to get prosecutorial discretion. It's just not. You can get all the things you want. They've been arrested, even arrests and not convictions, they're not going to get prosecutorial discretion. I mean, I'm not getting prosecutorial discretion for people who have never had any criminal contact whatsoever. And it seems to be the way that they're doing prosecutorial discretion, and we talked about this with Daryl Lynn before, is if you have a good case or you have a way that you can get some other immigration benefit outside of immigration court, then you have a chance to get prosecutorial discretion. But for just humanitarian purposes, I'm not seeing it. And I don't see anything within this new memo that would change it. Now, the DHS attorney did agree for a continuance on a case I have where I put up a prosecutorial discretion request that's coming up at the end of the month. And he agreed to a continuance so they could review it. under the new guidelines. So
Right.
maybe these will work as like another reminder, and maybe that
Yeah.
will soften them up, but we'll see.
And we should be clear, it is important, I think, to realize there's sort of two parts of enforcement. Like one is on the ground, how do people get picked up and put in removal proceedings? And the practice under Trump and under Obama during the early years and before that was, if ICE rolled up on somebody, they had a tip or they thought that somebody was living at a house, somebody who'd been deported before, and they kicked down the door and they realized it was some other Hispanic family. Their practice was to just arrest them anyways. Whatever. We're here. We might as well do this thing. And what Obama did at the end of his second term was to say, all right, you know what? We should really only be arresting people who are sort of in these enforcement priorities. And I think they did a fairly good job of that, at least from what I saw here in my practice area. They had encounters with lots of people who they would actually bring in and then tell them, like, you're fine. Like, you don't need to come back. And that's the thing that Trump reversed. And they started doing this sort of roll up whoever you can find thing. These memos might be effectively enforced on the ground level right now. I haven't seen any of those kinds of large scale sort of raids or people being rolled up on accident like we were seeing under Trump. So it's possible that at that level, these things are.
Yeah, have you had new detained cases?
Well, so
I mean, that haven't come from prison to immigration detention or haven't come from the border? Because I don't do a ton of detained cases, but I haven't had many of those calls.
I had one.
Which would be, I would say, interior enforcement.
Yeah, I had one, and it was somebody who had a criminal conviction, but it was 3 years old. And they were just now getting around to arresting them. And that was a case where looking at the underlying circumstances of the conviction would have been really useful because it was basically an accident. But it looks really serious on paper. So anyhow, these memos might be doing really good work at the community level and in reducing the amount of fear and terror that people are living under. Where we aren't seeing any real major change is the people who are actually already in proceedings facing removal. And it seems like DHS is really driven by trying to reduce their backlog in the immigration court, because what I've been told explicitly over and over again is that they don't want to do administrative closure, which is where you basically shelf a case. It's still there, but it's not on the calendar. But they will offer dismissal, which removes the person completely from removal proceedings, which is to me, it's really odd for DHS to say, we want to aggressively pursue returning these people to a completely undocumented in the shadows status. But that's the position they're currently taking.
I do have a case where my client next year, her adult son will be eligible to apply for his naturalization. He doesn't have any bars to naturalization, so he shouldn't have any problems. And she has an individual coming up relatively soon, and they agreed first to dismiss it, but she gets a work permit. That's while she's in proceedings. So I just asked, I'm like, would you be willing to admin close? And they're like, oh yeah, okay, that's fine.
Right.
Maybe we are getting some softening. I hope that's the case.
Right. I mean, to be sure, under Trump, there was no discretion.
Oh yeah. I mean, it wasn't even worth asking, right?
If you had a case where somebody had a pending other type of visa, or hey, this person is months away from getting a green card. All we have to do is just continue this or put it on the shelf. No, they were going to move forward with the hearing, and that was that. And in those circumstances, we are seeing some willingness when there's alternative relief to close cases or whatever. But yeah, just overall, pretty embarrassing that this is the second go round, or third, because technically this memo is updating a February memo. And then there was the May memo. And now they're saying that they're going to do, I guess, another round of memos in November. And really all they had to do was to reissue the November 2014 Obama memo.
Yeah.
Which we all practiced with for 2 years. Us, ICE attorneys, we all knew what it was. It wasn't so long ago that it's been memory hold. They could have just said, that's the memo now. And instead, it's these sorts of things. It's really kind of irritating. But
So during the pandemic, when there was no court, they had trial attorneys just doing busy work to recalendar cases that had been administratively closed under Obama. So they seem that they really want their attorneys working. So I wonder if a lot of this is, we're going to be there anyways. We might as well just do the case.
right,
And I don't know. We'll see what happens. Hopefully these new memos.
clear some stuff up.
But yes, they are out to get us, Stephen. You are correct.
I did want to talk about this piece by Mike L'Souza, Disjointed DHS Gumming Up Immigration Gears Report Finds.
Is that the one that you sent me so I could review it?
I didn't send it to you because it's paywalled. So,
Oh,
and what do I look like? Some sort of pirate?
yes.
I'm not going to send you a paywalled article. Instead, I'm just going to read it to you.
Okay.
Basically, there's a report from an immigration think tank, which found that the Department of Homeland Security lacks coordination internally and with other government agencies. And that made me think that we should start a think tank that just publishes super obvious stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
I think so. It's a podcast is.
Kind of, right? We've already got that going. But anyways, the report talks about the lack of communication between CBP, ICE, and USCIS, that they're all working to maximize their own interests and not about working across the three agencies. And one of the examples that they give is an unaccompanied minor comes to the border. They're picked up by Border Patrol. They might be transferred to ICE custody or HHS. Their case is then supposed to be handed over to the DOJ, the Executive Office for Immigration Review, the Immigration Court. And I don't know, how often are you seeing these cases? I have dozens of cases, literally, of people who were apprehended at the border in 2018, 19, and their notices to appear never made it to the immigration court. Or I've got one family where the father's notice to appear was filed, but not the kids or the wife. Or another family where one of the daughters of the 4 kids, one of the daughters was calendared separately. She's got her own case. She's like 12. And then the rest of the family was calendared as a family unit. I mean, this sort of stuff happens all the time. And one of the things that this made me think about, going back to these PD requests that they're having us do, they want us to submit a formal request, and that's supposed to include a criminal history statement, a sworn statement by the respondent attesting to their criminal history, plus all the records involved with any criminal encounter. And it just seems really weird that after 20 years, the Department of Homeland Security is still asking respondents to clear up their own criminal history, that they don't even have the tools to pull from all these different sources and piece together a clear view of what somebody's criminal history is. But yeah, I mean, how do you see this playing out in your practice with these different agencies sort of failing to interact and work together?
It's frustrating, right? Because again, I have the same type of clients who came in 2017, 2018, 2019, and they've never been put into immigration court. Typically, you have to apply for asylum within 1 year of coming in, so it can have some pretty dire consequences. But then also it plays out with, you have Border Patrol who produces certain documents that would be helpful to us. And lots of times Border Patrol, once they steal all our clients' belongings and like throw them away, they don't give them necessary documents that we need. They say they do. Then the case is transferred to the ICE prosecutors and they might never file them with the court. Then they have those documents and it's hard to get from them. And sometimes they don't have those documents. And the whole point of the Department of Homeland Security was to keep these departments from being siloed.
Right.
So they all communicate effectively with one another.
That's exactly right.
And it just doesn't seem like it happened.
Right.
I just had one frustrating thing where my client was in immigration court and the judge asked, how do you plead to the allegations on the notice to appear? So I just denied everything. And so the judge said to the government attorney, can you file those documents that is going to prove your case? Which is weird. You think they should have to file their evidence beforehand, but whatever. And he said, well, the fact is that the guy's from El Salvador and he's here in the United States. So obviously he entered illegally. And the judge is like, well, first of all, he never admitted to being from El Salvador. And second of all, there are other ways to enter the United States. Like, This is your burden. And the only thing I wanted were some documents that the Border Patrol would have produced.
Right.
It's called the I-213, and they can be really important. And I had even asked him before the hearing, can you just send me the I-213? And he's like, no. Okay, so then we have to go through these games. And then he has to go file this. And nothing makes a lot of sense. And maybe he didn't even have it. He might not have even had it in his file. He might have had to go and get it.
Right.
And then when you put in the Office of Refugee Resettlement for unaccompanied minors, then that's a whole thing that played out in the Castro Tum situation that we've talked about ad nauseum way too much, about how those records don't necessarily get transferred to the department, to the ICE prosecutors that can provide them to the immigration judges to make sure that service. And then also that results in children being lost in the system as well. The DHS was supposed to solve the specific problems that we're talking about, and it hasn't. And so, it might be helpful if they actually had a secretary of DHS that was actually, ratified by the Congress, right?
Right. I had a case recently where we filed a motion to reconsider at the Board of Immigration Appeals in 2019. And out of nowhere, I get an email from the board saying, can you email us a copy of your motion?
Yeah.
And
no, by the way, I was thinking like you've already told me this story before.
Okay.
But it wasn't you. It was like
10 other people.
10 other people have told me the same story.
I was like, okay, that's weird. So I email it to him. And then I get an email from the DHS attorney, the ICE attorney, who had filed like a boilerplate opposition to my motion at the time, saying like, hey, can you email me a copy of my opposition to your motion to reconsider? Because she had gotten the same email from the board. Like the board is trying to reconstruct this motion because they've lost it, apparently. They don't digitalize anything. It's funny because they won't let us email them these motions or file them electronically. And so therefore, they don't have an electronic copy. They've got to ask for it 2 years later when some clerk loses the physical file. But DHS is also being asked for their copy, but the ICE attorney doesn't have their submission either. So I'm being asked to reconstruct the entire record. Here's my original motion. Here's the government's opposition to my motion.
You should write up a decision and send it to them.
I feel like for my trouble, they should just grant the motion. But, it's sort of indicative of this problem. And you're right. I mean, DHS, the whole point in the wake of 9/11 was like, oh, well, 9/11 happened because we have these disparate agencies that aren't effectively communicating. And here we are years later, and we're in essentially the same position.
Now, I would say that they could probably just do away with every agency we just was speaking about, and we would be fine as a nation. We'd be better off.
Now, listen, I'm trying to earn some brownie points. So I want to say to my brothers and sisters at the Department of Homeland Security, you're doing excellent work. It's not your fault. It's the bureaucrats in Washington. All of you, whoever's going to be involved in any of the cases I do, you guys are doing God's work. Godspeed and God bless you. That's all I'm going to say about that.
That was Stephen Robbins, just so everyone knows.
Stephen Robbins. Matthew Archambault. What's your bar number? Bar number 22222. You got to watch out for that guy.
So an attorney named Martha Menendez wrote an op-ed that got printed in the Nevada.
Oh my God. What?
Good night. Nevada. How would you say?
It's Nevada. It's Nevada.
Nevada Independent. And it's entitled Some So-Called Advocates Are Anything But.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that we talked about. She is the legal manager for Justice in Motion. It's a New York-based organization. So she knows she's a real leftist, one of our left coast friends. But she talks about how during the Trump administration, all of a sudden immigration lawyers kind of became rock stars. They had pictures of us, not me and Stephen, because, we had better to do, but at airports with laptops and during the whole like Muslim ban and all that.
No, hold on. We didn't have better to do.
We did.
We're lazy.
No, we're just lazy. We're a little lazy.
I don't live near an airport, so.
Oh, okay.
What was I supposed to do? Drive there?
Yeah. I mean, our colleagues who went to the airports, and they not only were they there to assist people, but also as advocates
Right.
against the Muslim ban. I mean, they did great work, and they were rightfully hailed as heroes, right? And Susan Church from Boston, who I believe was on the show, she was in Boston and she was there in federal court making the case. And we could spend the rest of the show naming all the great attorneys. But, they were looked at as heroes. And then the work that our advocacy, I'm speaking generally, was kind of hailed. And people were like, oh, these guys are really fighting against that evil Trump. And then, as predictable as anything else that could be, Biden became president. And as we've outlined over our shows since Biden was president, not a ton has changed. There has been some changes, but there are some really deep humanitarian issues with the Biden administration. But now people just don't want to talk about it. And we have a lot of immigration so-called advocates that want to give Biden the benefit of the doubt that they would never have given Trump, rightfully so. Trump, and I don't think either one of them deserved the benefit of the doubt. But generally, how do you look at this issue right now?
Well, I mean, she's playing fast and loose with the definition of rock star, first of all. I don't know that any immigration lawyer was ever a rock star. But I mean, look, I think we've highlighted in the last few months some of these stories of immigration lawyers, some, I wouldn't say it's the majority, but coming out in defense of, for example, the immigration detention center up there in New York. I've seen a little bit of that locally, not too much with the Northwest Detention Center, but every once in a while when there's talk of shutting down a detention center like that, there's some cohort, some small group of immigration lawyers who only do detained work at that one place who suddenly become very concerned about their bottom line. But it's certainly not the majority of us. I don't want to come across as too defensive. I mean, I also don't think it's true that we're not having the conversation. I see plenty of people willing to talk about it. We're talking about the terrible expulsion flights to Haiti and what's going on at the border. But it is just the fact that when a Democrat gets in there, I think a lot of people become more defensive. And also, the Democrat is less abrasive about their position. And I think it makes it harder to coalesce around a certain position. Trump was just grosser on the face of the thing. So he would come out and he had a Muslim ban and he would do a rally and say disgusting things. And it became very easy, even for people who were uninterested in politics in general, to say, I'm against that. That's terrible. I can see very plainly that what he's doing or saying is wrong. When you have a Democratic administration doing effectively the same things, but getting up and saying, we're very concerned about this and that, or Title 42 is not an immigration policy, it's a public health policy. I think a lot of those people who maybe are not so politically active tend to fall off and become disengaged because they're satisfied with those answers that they're getting. It is true that there is some cohort of immigration lawyers who have bad instincts. It's definitely true, and it's a problem.
Yeah, and I look at it as it's almost like you're rooting for a sports team.
Yeah.
Here from my football fans, I'm an Eagles fan, and we hate the Dallas Cowboys. So the Dallas Cowboys can do the exact same thing that the Philadelphia Eagles do, and Philadelphia Eagles fan will criticize Dallas and say how terrible they are and make excuses for the Eagles. And I think it's the same here, but when you're looking at Trump and Biden. But what is true, though, is what you're saying is Trump is just wholly grosser than Biden. Trump just came out and said that we had to keep the Haitians out of here because they all have AIDS.
Right.
And so as an advocate, when you're like, oh, Biden's doing these terrible things to the Haitians, which he is doing, he's spending $15 million on expulsion flights while claiming that they don't have the resources to process these, or spend $15 million to Geo Group to get them out of here. When you point that out and they go, yeah, well, Trump would have just kicked them out anyways because he thinks they all have AIDS. Look at that racist. So Some people on our side have that problem where they go to criticize someone like Biden and then they're immediately put into the like, well, would you prefer Trump? Then they have to defend against Trump, and it's human nature to be like, well, this isn't so bad. We're seeing a lot better response than we did under Obama, though.
Yeah, that's true. A couple things are also true. One, a lot of people just have bad instincts on immigration, and that includes immigration lawyers. There are immigration lawyers who are very conservative. There are some who think, well, my client got a DUI, so he kind of deserves to be deported. We see that kind of attitude and perspective amongst our colleagues quite often. We see in these sort of Facebook groups that we float around in a lot of hostility towards clients.
Oh, yeah.
Talking about them in terms of their intelligence or how annoying they are, and these sorts of things. And so it's not breaking news that a lot of attorneys are advocates at the end of the day, right? That they're self-interested, that they're in it for the money or whatever. And, the other dynamic that you're seeing, I think, right now with the border, like I said, this is sort of a sub-argument of Trump being grosser than Biden is. With Trump, if he was saying immigrants are dirty, they have AIDS, they're coming here, and then you see what's happening at the border, it's easy to attribute the one thing to the other. He's gross, he's a racist, and then this stuff is happening. And right now, what you're seeing, I think, when my mom watches CNN and it just seems chaotic and crazy, and she doesn't really know why or like where to assign sort of the blame. And unfortunately, I think the media has done a really poor job of laying that out. And so for a lot of people, the blame ends up sort of vaguely being on like, well, foreign countries or the immigrants themselves, instead of, no, there's policy reasons why this is happening and there's things we could do to alleviate it.
Yeah.
So
Biden was given a tough job, bad hand, right?
Yeah, bad hand, and he's inherited a problem. I mean, that's sort of where a lot of people tend to go.
I kind of want to read Martha's words and then get your reaction. It's a little long, but stick with me. So this is Martha Menendez. It says, my issue is with those attorneys who hold themselves out to be immigrant rights heroes. Selfless human rights advocates relentlessly posting selfies from court and jail. Don't do that. Humble bragging about all they do for their clients and their communities, and all the while lobbying behind closed doors for the machine to keep churning them out new clients. To put it simply, you are all the worst. You are most definitely not advocates. If you are not an abolitionist, if you do not stand for the complete elimination of immigration detention in all its forms, you are not an advocate. If you believe immigrants can and should be labeled good or bad, and that only the good ones deserve our empathy or your support, you are not an advocate. If you believe migrating is a privilege and not a human right, you are not an advocate, probably a little racist. And finally, if you aren't working every day to end the need for detained deportation defense, basically to make your job obsolete, you are not an advocate. So those are Martha Menendez's words. I happen to agree with all of them. So, Stephen?
What do I think? Yeah, I mean, it's really true. I agree as well. I think that some of these things are so easy to fall into, the labeling of good or bad immigrants, pitting one group against the other. Just yesterday, I talked to a guy, an immigrant, hardworking, tax-paying. That's how he's self-described. And he was saying, I've been here forever. And he's got a U visa that's been pending for 3 years. And I had to break the news to him that, like, guess what? It's going to be another 10 or whatever. And he was saying, I'm here, I'm hardworking, I pay my taxes, and the government's spending all its time on these people at the border.
Yeah.
And so I had to give him a lesson on, look, you guys need to be united against the real enemy here, right? It's not that you are the good ones and they're the bad ones. It's that you guys are both getting by the system, and the system is the enemy. And I think he took it really well. And I think he probably learned from that. And as advocates, we tend to do that sometimes unwittingly. We say, oh, I had this really sympathetic case. She pays her taxes. She's never been in trouble. And the implication, I mean, sometimes we have to describe a case, right? So,
yeah,
when those are the facts, those are the facts. But
you got to present it, right?
Right.
And for that one client. You have to advocate for that client that's in front of you.
Right.
And if that means subtly throwing everyone else under the bus, then in a general term,
Right. But sometimes what that comes across as is there's this other group that deserves to get deported or mistreated or detained indefinitely. Not my guy, not this person, but these other people do.
Yeah.
That's the one thing, honestly, like I'm so grateful for Nora Phillips, who several years ago talked me into taking this case of one of her friends who was at the Northwest Detention Center. And it was this guy.
Is there someone that's not Nora's friend?
Nora's friend. That's true. I'm not really narrowing it down too much, but this guy had a rap sheet a mile long. I grew up in basically rural white Oregon. I would have never come across a person like this with this kind of background. And taking this case forced me to get to know this person and understand them and understand what they'd been through and understand his story and to become a vocal advocate for him. And honestly, like it was an experience that really changed my life. And unfortunately, I think, that's a slow, involved, time-intensive transformation. It takes a lot of time to go through that and to get to know somebody. And most people don't have that opportunity. And it's so easy to reflexively sort of make these judgments.
I think there are a lot of attorneys, I'm just talking about immigration attorneys right now, who don't think that deeply about it, right? They have a job to do. They're hired by clients to do it, and they do their work and they go home and whatnot. And I would have to say probably 10 years or so ago, I may have fallen into that. It wasn't until I started doing the work up at Berks. So we can shout out to Bridget Cambria and Carol Donahue and for them for changing my outlook, so to speak. But if you're an attorney and you're kind of offended by what Martha Menendez wrote and what I said, maybe take a step back and look at it. Look internally at yourself. Because maybe you haven't really thought about these things. Because as Stephen says, sometimes we do have to, when we're making our case, like why this person you should give sympathy and empathy and relief to, Mr. Judge or Mr. Prosecutor or Mrs. Prosecutor. Sometimes we do have to frame it in that way as, hey, they're a good one. It's not as effective to say, everyone is deserving of this. I'm not even going to tell you about my guy or my lady. Right. You know what? I'm not even going to tell you if they've ever worked a day in their life, if they paid their taxes. As a human, they deserve empathy and sympathy, and migration's a human right. All is true. They should be allowed to stay. That's not the world we work in, unfortunately.
Right.
So we have to kind of separate our courtroom advocacy from the way we frame it in real life, so to speak.
Right. And it's hard if you are an immigration lawyer and you're looking at your calendar and it's like, I've got 10 cancellation cases coming up. Your time is all tied up in getting the evidence and prepping for test, doing these things to save these individual families and clients. And it's hard to know how or when to take time to advocate for the broader deconstruction of the system, because that's not part of your daily job.
And maybe you don't have to, but make space for those who do, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And don't get in the way, for sure.
Yeah. Don't get in the way and don't advocate against it. So if you're offended, check yourself.
Before you wreck yourself.
Exactly. And Martha Menendez, it's called Nevada Independent. Some so-called advocates are anything but. Google it. She's on Twitter. You can find her on Twitter. Really great piece. And I think it will make you think.
I'd like to have her on and let's get down to specifics. Like what?
Name check some people.
Yeah. Who are you talking about? Let's drag some people. Let's get the names up there. But what would she have us do differently or do better?
Yeah.
Advocating for the dismantling of the system. What does that mean exactly? Right? Because it can't just be tweeting and it can't just be, having some hot takes on Facebook. So let's reach out to her and see if she'll.
Yeah.
All right.
Anyway, Stephen.
Love you, buddy. Good talking to you.
Love you. Have fun.
And we'll talk to you soon.
See ya.
Bye.